He's like, why? And I'm
Once
like,
upon a time.
Space in a land
I saw my
far
children.
away.
Oh, I thought you were acting.
I'm
right now,
Katrina.
like joking.
And I'm Jeff.
No,
This is
out
the
of the corner of my eye, I
Fairytellers
saw movement,
podcast.
and then there was like
Myth,
a thing,
legend,
and it was just my
folklore,
children.
fable.
We explore
These
what they
headphones
say
are
about
good.
cultures then and now,
Grab a hot cup of cocoa and a comfy seat.
while we tell you a tale.
Welcome back to the podcast. Another fantastic episode. And timely, I'd say.
Indeed, we're hoping it's timely.
That's true.
We have been meaning for literal years to have March kind of be Speranza Wilde fairy tale episode time, and just not got to it. And so that's what we're going to be doing this time. But before we get too far into it, I just wanted to say that we are going to be on an episode upcoming of Not My Fantasy podcast alongside Fairy Tale Fix podcast to discuss the new live action Snow White, which will be coming out in the middle
Soon.
of March. Yeah, I was trying to remember
To
if
a
it was
theater near you.
I was trying to remember if it's coming out before or after we release this episode. I think it's like the day that we release this episode or something like that is coming out. It's crazy, Jeff, because I feel like they have been making this movie basically since you and I started recording the podcast.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And it was supposed to come out a year ago, but because of the writer's strike and they didn't know how long the writer's strike was going to go on, they pushed back all of the plans for the movie for a year, because it was supposed to come out March 2024, which is why we were doing the Snow White project. And then in 2023, and then the end cap, we were going to kind of like revisit it and do like a special episode that like was basically like reviewing, talking about the movie. But then the movie never came out. And so then Cullen and Hannah of Not My Fantasy podcast invited us on to talk about the new live action Snow White, since that is the whole point of like their podcast. So perfect place for that episode to happen and take place, and it'll be great. So that should be out sometime in early April. So be looking out for that. I'm sure that like we'll post a link when we have a link. And I'm anticipating that recording this episode with them should be a ton of fun. 'Cause obviously we have to see the movie before we can like talk about it. But Not My Fantasy podcast right now, they have a couple episodes that they've put out of other Snow White related movies and content, including the very first Disney Snow White movie. And I was watching that episode. Not only did they like give us a shout out, which I thought was like super nice, and like their episode where they were like they mentioned it was like the color theory episodes on Snow White that we had done back when we did like our Snow White project. So it's like not only, did they mention us in that podcast, but also I learned so much stuff about the live action, or not live action. I learned so much about the original Disney Snow White that I did not know. So I thought it was super informative, great watch. So go and listen to Not My Fantasy podcast when they talk about the, 1935 Snow White, Disney Snow White. It's pretty good. But the episode that we're going to be on, it's going to have 6 different hosts, all coming at this movie from different perspectives. So it should be a really good episode. We're all really fun and funny people, if I do say so myself.
It's going to be fun, going to be chaotic, and it's going to be like 4.5 hours long.
Yeah.
That's my prediction.
Yeah. It is going to be a beast. And speaking of Fairy Tale Fix, who we're going to be on Not My Fantasy podcast with, doing the Snow White episode with them. Last year, we were on their podcast, and I found them some Speranza Wilde fairy tales to tell and laugh about. And last year, I joked that it's funny because I had wanted to do a March episode of all Speranza Wilde tales for a really long time. And I was only able to pull it together for their podcast. And it was an awesome episode, in my opinion. I just thought the tales are funny. Hanging out with them was fun. A lot of laughing going on. A lot of wild motifs. On Fairy Tale Fix, they read out the fairy tales that they find, and then they talk about like how they would fix them, adapt them. And it's very fun because we all know that feeling of like reading through a fairy tale and being like, what the heck is this? What wild ride am I on? That cat got this man pregnant.
That was insane.
Yeah. Or even getting to the end and being like, I could get on board with this story, but not this lady like marrying this dude. This dude should be eaten by a dragon.
Uh-huh.
That might just be me that like feels that way when I get to the end of those stories. But anyway, so on their podcast, they're able to kind of do that when they get to the end, is kind of saying, yeah, what parts are awesome, what parts are really interesting, what parts are good for like some kind of an adaptation, but like also like what would we change? So it's a really cool podcast. Abby and Kelsey, highly recommend if people haven't listened to that from last year to listen to that just for the fun. Oh my gosh. I think I'm going to re-listen to it too, just because the stories are so wild.
Speranza Wilde.
What?
You said the stories are so wild.
I thought you were correcting. I thought I had mispronounced Speranza Wilde's name at some point, and I was like,
nope.
Katrina, you idiot. I have to stop calling myself an idiot. I'm not an idiot. I have dyslexia. It's fine. And I didn't mess up her name. It's okay. Yes. Your joke was funny, Geoff. Good job.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm self-conscious and neurotic at the moment.
Okay.
Somehow I want to splice it in there so I still have you saying like Speranza Wilde.
I believe in you.
We'll both laugh now. Ha 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 ha.
Good time. I think you'll listen back and realize how good my fake laugh was.
So this year, now that I'm not in the middle of trying to get through midterms and finish up a degree, I'm ready to actually do a Speranza Wilde episode for our own podcast.
Nice.
So we've talked lightly before about who Speranza Wilde was, but it's always a good time for a refresher.
Yeah, because I forgot. I forgot a lot. I know a very little. It's Oscar Wilde's mother.
Yes.
That's the extent of my
Yeah.
knowledge.
And I mean, what is upsetting is like, because she's a woman, not really a lot gets talked about in regards to her.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, we on the podcast don't really even cover like the breadth of what she would create, because like she was a writer, she was a poet who wrote poems and literature of her like own, based on, her own interests. So Wilde, what a joke. I was going to say like wild, but we can't. I'm like, I can't keep saying wild. But yeah, no, Wilde, that her children also grew up to be like artists and like literary geniuses. It's like, how did that happen? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Like,
maybe it's Maybelline.
That was a good one. So anyway, so Speranza Wilde was her pen name. Her actual name was Lady Jane Francesca Angus Wilde. And that doesn't even include her maiden name, which was LG. So her life was really complicated. Her dad died when she was younger, and she kind of was in a precarious spot social class wise, where her dad had kind of risen them up into kind of being like more of like a merchant class. So still like it's like tradespeople and stuff, but a little more like hoity-toity, had a little bit more like kind of like going on with them money-wise, but he died when she was younger. And so her mother was still kind of able to have her be like introduced and around kind of like richer people, but they were not. wealthy. And so she kind of had like an interesting peek into what like the higher class was doing, but also definitely could not like live or sustain that lifestyle like as a child.
Mhm.
But she grew up to be very educated because her mom was able to like make sure that she got like a really good education. She studied languages. They say that she knew 10 different languages before she like left home. Which I was like, 10 different languages? Like, geez Louise, girl. So like very smart, very like brilliant, was able to get like a really good education. And she loved Irish folk tales. And specifically, she really loved Irish folklore because she was an Irish nationalist. And we've talked about this before on the podcast about how, for better or worse, folk tales and folklore in general help to give cultural identity to a people. They kind of, when you're gathering up, okay, what are the things that make us us? What things do we do that are different from like everybody else? Like that naturally creates this like us versus them mentality because you're directly comparing. This is what makes us Irish is what makes you not Irish. Like you not doing those things means that like you don't understand fully what it is to be like culturally Irish. And when people understand the power of folklore to create a solid identity, they can use that power for different things, good or bad. Because obviously we have an example of the Brothers Grimm where I'm like, unfortunately, that the Brothers Grimm eventually, they were also trying to form this like national identity. And in the years after it had been like written, collected, and then like edited, solidified, that book became as popular in Germany as the Bible. People were just as likely to have a copy of the Brothers Grimm collection in their home as a Bible, which in like the 1800s and early 1900s, like that's saying a lot because, you know, most people had Bibles in their house. And to say that most Germans had like a copy of that. And so, you know, their collection was able to form this like identity for Germans, which was then used for different types of propaganda, as you can imagine. Germany in the early 1900s.
Nothing could possibly go wrong with that.
It's probably fine. It wasn't.
It definitely.
But for Speranza Wilde, as a self-proclaimed Irish nationalist, exactly what she wanted to do was help to create this idea of like a national cultural identity for Ireland. She didn't want to see Irish cultural heritage be covered up and displaced any more than it like historically had been by invading powers, which is also very interesting that she had that idea. And then when you're reading through the work that she's the most famous for in regards to folklore and fairy tales, which is called Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland. So that's what she's the most famous for in regards to like folklore and fairy tale. And it's interesting when you're reading through it because she very much is coming at it from the point of view of that Christianity is truth and important, is like kind of like central to like where human beings like need to get to. And so it's interesting that she's also wanting to stop Irish cultural heritage from being covered up and displaced by any more forces, mainly like England was the invading force that she was trying not to let them like
of course
tamp out everything. But one of the things that she was doing when she was looking at the folklore of Ireland was she believed that if you could take a lot of the mythologies from around the world and find some of the common threads throughout, that you would be able to go back to like this a human, like basic human truths. And so kind of the Bible at the beginning of the Bible, back to like that point of like Adam and Eve, and discover more of like the pure truths that God gave to Adam and Eve, which that's a take.
And it's not like an entirely original take either. There are a lot of people that thought, well, like very similar things as far as just like taking all the stories around the world and boiling them down to the lowest common denominator and seeing how they're all actually the same if you ignore all the things that are different about them.
Yeah. And so I want to quote from like her book specifically, so it doesn't sound like I'm like totally like talking out of pocket like about her. She wrote, "Meanwhile, in Europe, there is diligent study of the ancient myths, legends, and traditions of the world in order to extract from them that information respecting the early modes of thought prevalent amongst the primitive race, and also the lines of the first migrations, which no other monuments of antiquity are so well able to give. Traditions, like rays of light, take their color from the medium through which they pass." Which, that's like, what she's talking about is like pretty standard for when you're talking about like, oh, we can use the similarities of myth to show how they were transmitted like across the globe, how they migrated, but then also how like human beings like migrated. Obviously, the term primitive race was like, it's not a term that we use in anthropology like anymore, but it was like back then.
Yeah.
Traditions, like rays of light, take their color from the medium through which they pass. But the scientific mythographic student knows how to eliminate the accidental addition from the true primal basis, which remains fixed and unchangeable, and from the numerous myths and legends of the nations of the earth, which bear so striking a conformity to each other that they point to a common origin. He will be able to reconstruct the first articles of belief in the creed of humanity, and to produce almost with certainty upon the primal source of the lines of human life that now traverse the globe in all directions. So some of that was very much like the thinking of the day, anthropologically, like speaking, like how anthropologists were thinking like of that time period. But when she's talking about like tracing things back to the beginning, she's assuming that, quote, "this source of all life, creed, and culture now on earth, have no reason to doubt, will be found in Iran, or Persia, as we call it, and in the ancient legends and language of the great Iranian people, the head and noblest type of the Aryan races." And she talks a little bit about like how they and their religions, their God was the one supreme creator and upholder of all things, whose symbol was the sun and the pure elemental fire. And so like this God, the more you go back through to like Babylon, Assyria, the Canaanites, like into Egypt. And so she's kind of like, oh, you can see, like if you go back to where the Bible originated, where like the Old Testament story like originated, we'll see that that's the beginning spot of like that like one eternal like truth, which at the time, like when she was writing this, there were still different things that had yet to be kind of like discovered and researched and looked over and looked through to show that like the earliest myths of that nature that would be related to like the Old Testament, like it didn't start in the Old Testament. There were myths that had been in existence and written down in other groups in that area. And so it's fine. Whether all of this to say that like it's just really interesting, you know, that her goal in writing down some of this like Irish cultural heritage was to kind of like make sure that it didn't get displaced like any more than like it had been. And we know that at the time, a lot of it had already been very like morphed and changed by all the people that have been passing through that area or settling for long periods of time or changing. So it's just very interesting how much history had already like come and gone like through there. And she was like, I'm going to capture this like Irish cultural heritage. And she did. She captured like the moment that she was capturing it. She was capturing like that moment. It's important stuff to have and like hold on to. But it doesn't freeze it in time in, the year 100 AD. It freezes it in the moment that she was in.
Right.
And it's complex and it's complicated, but she did a lot to like help that conversation and to get specific like points to look at. So this book that Speranza Wilde wrote down, it is a big collection. I want to encourage people to find it and get it. I'm pretty sure that you can find it to download on like a lot of different places. I know that if you have like a Hoopla account, if you have like Libby, like through like your library, your local library, whatever, I absolutely recommend getting like a Kindle version like of this book to look at. We're going to give you kind of samples of like what's inside of it to get you into reading it, because the thing is, when you have a writer, you have a figure like Speranza Wilde, and their stuff for so long gets kind of overlooked and buried. The only way to really bring this person's legacy back into the like forefront of human dialogue and conversation and whatnot is for people to actually like read it, is to like go out and get it where it is available. And a great example of this is Zora Neale Hurston, incredible folklorist, anthropologist, writer, but her stuff for years, decades, was like completely overlooked in the United States because she was a Black woman. She was an African American woman, and people were like, no, thank you. I don't want to like read your stuff. And it wasn't until people like Alice Walker and Henry Louis Gates Jr. continually brought her up, wrote about her, put her name like back out into the world, and credited her for, like Alice Walker would credit her for helping to advance like her own writing because of how she was inspired by Zora Neale Hurston. And now Zora Neale Hurston's name is back up there with like the great writers of the time period because people brought it up. And so the whole reason why I'm on this wild tangent, wild tangent, is because Lady Jane Francesca Angus Wilde, Speranza Wilde, shouldn't just be remembered as, like Oscar Wilde's mom, but she should be like regarded for the work that she did in her own right. So I encourage people to go and read the book. And so to encourage people to do that, I'm going to tell you about the tidbits that can be found inside of this book.
Yeah. A little teaser.
A little teaser for you. So the book is kind of broken up into several different parts, and there are a lot of stories that are fun and interesting and that you would definitely love, including the ones that we told on the Fairy Tale Fix podcast, The Legend of Bali Totus Castle, or as we like to call it, a classic cross-species MPreg situation. Absolutely wild. Some of the stories that we're going to be retelling today, obviously, will also be in this, like from the collection of stories that she has in here. But then also there's different superstitions that she writes about. There's different festivals and beliefs around like those festivals, including spells for November. Of course, everybody needs spells for November. And so there's just a lot of superstitions around nature, legends concerning different animals. Like there's so much just interesting stuff. And also including the properties of herbs and their use in medicine. It's a big collection of just really fascinating things. Yeah. So I thought that I would read you guys some charms that are found in part 6 of this book. How to have money always.
I am all ears.
All right, but let's see if you have what it takes. So, first, You have to kill a black rooster and go to the meeting of 3 crossroads where a murderer is buried. See, that's where it gets complicated because...
Look, I was out as soon as you had to kill a crow. Crows are pretty cool. I don't want to kill.
Not crow, rooster.
Oh, rooster? That thing's dead. I mean...
Yeah, you're in.
Finding a crossroads. Where can we find a crossroads that murderers are buried at in 2025? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're not burying murderers at crossroads like we used to in this country.
Yeah, so true. Especially like a 3-pronged crossroad. I feel like those are harder to find than like the classic like 4-pronged crossroads. So I'm like, already.
Without a murderer even.
Yeah, like this is going to take some planning. So you have this dead bird, the rooster. So throw the dead bird over your left shoulder then and there after nightfall in the name of the devil.
Oh, gosh.
Holding a piece of money in your hand the whole time. And ever after, no matter what you spend, you will always find the same piece of money undiminished in your pocket.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. But again, yeah, it might be a little hard to meet all of those.
Yeah, that's a difficult list of requirements to accomplish.
I haven't watched Supernatural. I know that it's, the series has been not making new stuff for many, many years now, but it just seemed like something that like the Winchesters would have to do at some point.
Oh, yeah. I do remember when you said the crossroads thing too, I was like, there has been an episode, at least one.
Yeah.
Where they've like gone to a crossroads and like had to bury something or something crazy like that.
Yeah. So if somebody wants to do research on like where we would have to do that, we'll do that as like a folklore ostension field trip. So this next one, Geoff, that I'm going to tell you about, it is how to go invisible.
Another one of those. That's one of like the, when they say like, what superpower would you want?
Yes.
Like being invisible, I think would be a pretty good one.
Me too.
I don't know if it's always my like, my number one. I don't think it's, but it's up there. It's always in consideration.
Yeah. But you're not going to want to do this first step. If you were worried about killing crows beforehand, I mean, yeah, once I said rooster, you were like, oh, I'm back on board. But no, so this one is get a raven's heart. Oh, well, you know what? It doesn't say you have to kill the raven. You just have to get its heart. So roadkill. If you happen to find a dead raven, have I got a tip for you? So you get a raven's heart, split it open with a black haft knife. I don't know what that means. I'll have to figure it out. Make 3 cuts and place a black bean in each cut. Then plant it. And when the beans sprout, put one in your mouth and say, by virtue of Satan's heart and by strength of my great art, I desire to be invisible. And so it will be as long as the bean is kept in your mouth. So that one seems more doable than the getting money one.
Yeah, definitely. Which, I mean,
just because like it really does, it comes back to the 3-way crossroads where a murderer is buried.
Yeah.
I don't know where that would be. See, what we need to do now, stick with me on this. We need to do like a Dexter situation where I don't want to be a serial killer, Geoff, but if I'm killing other serial killers,
we can choose to bury them.
Yeah, there's a moral gray area. And then, we can bury them at a 3-way crossroads. And then we have this 3-way crossroads to use anytime we want because we know what's buried there.
Yeah.
For money reasons.
I'm in.
This is not a true crime podcast.
Not yet.
Not. So this one might be more useful to people because this is for the evil eye. So if you don't know what the evil eye is, then you should read this book because Speranza Wilde talks a lot about it. There are a lot of ways that you can get the evil eye like put on you, but then also there's a lot where you can kind of get accused of putting the evil eye on somebody. And so basically you just need to make sure that at all times you are kind of like blessing people, especially blessing children that are cute, that somebody might accuse you of being jealous of.
Mm.
Because there is nothing more dreaded by the people, nor considered more deadly in its effects than the evil eye. It may strike at any moment, unless the greatest precautions are taken, and even then there's no true help possible unless the fairy doctor is at once summoned to pronounce the mystic charm that can alone destroy the evil and fatal influence. Oh, God bless it, is what you need to be saying. Anytime you kind of like see a child that is super cute, you say God bless it, because you don't want that kid to get the evil eye put on them, and you don't want to be accused of the person that put the evil eye on the child. And I just want to say, like, side note, Geoff, this is going to be in the podcast, even though I'm whispering it to you. There was like a point in time where I was wondering if like I had the power to to accidentally, because it says in here that like you can accidentally, not realizing it, be a person that puts the evil eye onto people. Because there were some people in my community. This is when I was an adult. There were some people in my community who had wronged me in like some pretty like intensely grievous ways. And people in the community knew that I did not like these individuals. And in a matter of like months, some like horrible stuff. This one kid got like arrested and put in jail through his own behaviors, like his own actions. I didn't like I
how
didn't
is that on you?
Yeah.
Because you planted evidence.
Yeah.
Just
that's
kidding.
exactly what no. And I had tried to point out to other people that I felt like he was going down a pretty like dangerous road. And so then for that to happen, like anyway. So I'm like, that one's not on me. But the other one, it was like a month after that happened, this man who I had hard feelings towards, he had diverticulitis. And so his intestines ripped open and he had to have like an emergency surgery to like fix it. And
Yikes.
he ended up being okay. Like he's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But right after that happened, this friend of mine, and this was following the other thing where like that boy kind of was having his like comeuppance.
Mm-hmm.
This lady who knew all of us, she was like, Katrina, what kind of like spell have you put on these people? Where like, because that's like a horrible thing. And I was like, oh my gosh, I would not have, what happened to that man, I would not have wished on literally my worst enemy. I would not have wished that on him, on anybody. Like, that's absolutely horrific. I would have never done that on purpose. But it was like different things like that. Not as extreme. That one was the most extreme. But like little things like that. Like these like catastrophes kept happening to like all these like different people. And
to all of your enemies, coincidentally.
Yes. And I was like, did I put the evil eye on these people? Like, even as I was reading this now, and it's been like, I think like 7 or 8 years since this like happened. But as I was like reading this section where it was like, you can accidentally put the evil eye on somebody if you're a person who has like powerful like energies.
Which honestly is how I would describe you, as someone with powerful energies.
Very powerful energies. And I'm like, did I accidentally put the evil eye on these people? No, I don't think that I have that. For the soul is like a fine-tuned harp that vibrates to the slightest external force or movement, and the presence and glance of some persons can radiate around us a divine joy, while others may kill the soul with a sneer or a frown. We call these subtle influences mysteries, but the early races believed them to be produced by spirits, good or evil, as they acted on the nerves or the intellect.
Well, remind me not to get on your bad side.
Yeah, I will.
Like, imagining the evil eye were a thing that were possible to put on someone. Like, I don't think every bad thing happens because someone puts the evil eye on you. So it's like that. Were the evil eye something? So there's a lot of like presupposition that has to go on here, like assuming things are true that are like really unlikely to be true. But like, you know, if it was a thing that could be done, I think that it could be done in a situation. You know, even if the outcome is the same, it's the cause doesn't necessarily have to be the same. Does that make sense? I'm trying to think of like a real world example. Like I accidentally drop a glass on the ground and it shatters and breaks. Right?
Yeah.
Like that was just like an accident. It just slipped out of my hand. You slap a glass out of my hand and it falls onto the ground and breaks. Like in one of those situations, you caused the glass to break, and in the other one, you didn't. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like the glass breaking, I'm going way too. I was like, yeah. And I'm just saying, like, the glass, like human bodies, like glasses, are susceptible to breaking. But some of them, are getting pushed off the edge and others are not, Anyway, that has taken up too much time already.
But anyway, if you think that you have the evil eye has been like put on you by me or others,
you may be entitled to compensation.
Oh man, now like I'm going to be thinking about like you talking about, no, there are some times where like somebody could have caused you, like could have put the evil eye on you. But not all bad things that happen are because of the evil eye, but that doesn't mean that some of them are not. I'm going to keep thinking about that. So, for the evil eye, this is a charm Mary gave to Saint Bridget, and she wrote it down and hid it in the hair of her head without deceit. So this is the charm that Mary gave. Quote, if a fairy or a man or a woman hath overlooked thee, there are 3 greater in heaven who will cast all evil from thee into the great and terrible sea. Pray to them and to the 7 angels of God, and they will watch over thee. Amen. So it's this like idea of like remembering that like somebody may have called upon like the evil eye to be put on you, but if you remember that God is greater than all of like that, then you will have like a shadow protection over you. So if you ever need that, because of me or others, let me know. So some of these are theoretically, theoretically more useful to you than like trying to become invisible. Because there's also like prayers to give or spells like to say against drowning, prayers to have in time of battle. O Mary, who have the victory over all women, give me victory now over my enemies, that they may fall to the ground as wheat when it is mown. So like things like that, to tame a horse, for a sore like breast when you're like a breastfeeding mother, which I did think was really interesting just because when you're like breastfeeding, it's a little hard on your body, and different glands can get clogged and you have to like do stuff so I was like, oh, that like, so it's like some of this is like a mix of medicine and prayer, which is great. Absolutely perfect. For the bite of a mad dog, to cause love. These are all for a sprain. I was going to give you this one for a toothache in case you have anybody in your family.
Which I totally do. I mean, it's a little late for that. My wife just got a double root canal like this last week. So where were you with these charms, Katrina?
I know. I'm so sorry, because what she could have done was go to a graveyard, kneel upon any grave.
Doesn't have to be a murderer's grave this time?
No.
That's good.
Literally any grave. Say 3 prayers and 3 alms for the soul of the dead laying beneath. So as long as you've got their name.
Yeah, which conveniently written right there.
Yeah, so perfect. So 3 prayers, 3 alms for the soul of the dead laying beneath. Then take a handful of grass from the grave, chew it well, casting forth each bite without swallowing any portion. So don't swallow any of the grass.
So far, that seems like the hardest part, and not that hard.
Yeah, chew grass.
What'd you say? Sounds like something you would like to say to insult someone. Chew grass, buddy.
After this process, the sufferer, were he to live 100 years, will never have toothache anymore. So sorry I did not provide that to you before tonight. That's on me.
Yeah, just absolutely horrific timing.
Yeah, my bad. So yeah, if people want to look up this book and look at some of the like folk medicine things in here, because, you also have for rheumatism, for sty on the eyelid, to cure warts, a stitch in the side for weak eyes, hip disease, mumps, epilepsy, depression of heart.
Hey, you should share that one, because I'm sure there's some people that could use that.
Let's see. When a person becomes low and depressed and careless about everything, as if all vital strength and energy has gone, he is said to have got a fairy blast. You totally got blasted by fairies. And blast water must be poured over him by the hands of a fairy doctor while saying, "In the name of the saint with the sword, who has strength before God and stands at his right hand. Great care being taken that no portion of the water is profaned." Don't profane any portion of that water, Jeff.
Okay.
"Whatever is left after the operation must be poured on the fire." You've got to get rid of the blessed water so that it doesn't get profaned. So yeah, I'm sorry that you got fairy blasted.
You should be. It was your fault, I'm sure.
Probably. I probably put the evil eye on you. For one reason or another. No, I didn't do that. I don't think so.
Not on purpose.
No.
I
I wouldn't have had a reason.
Yeah.
I'll think of one.
This is not the direction I thought that this episode was going to go.
And so it is interesting how much, there is that like mix of herbal medicine for physical maladies and prayer that's involved. One thing that's really interesting to me looking at it from medical anthropology standpoint is that very much like religious persuasion and medicine have always been very like intertwined. Medicine and culture are also still to this day intertwined. Even if people think like if you're more aware of like the Western medical model, you might think, oh, well, no, culture doesn't like play a part in our medical practice. But even how people view different sicknesses is cultural. And so how we treat people who have those illnesses is very cultural. The same way that like if somebody has depression, it used to be very like cultural where like that now we're like, no, that's a medical something that's happening like in your body. There's chemical reactions in your brain. Like we can think of it like scientifically, but there's still such like a stigma about like the type of people who have depression or what they should do to get over it.
Yeah.
And so it is really interesting looking at the things that were considered medical issues that needed to be taken care of, because like some of these like medical issues are being cursed by fairies, like having a fairy attack your child. And so you're like, oh, how do I make sure that my kid doesn't get like an illness from a fairy? And those kids were probably getting sick, but it was like how they viewed it was different than like how we view it today. And so it's one of those things that's like super, super interesting to read through and look at. And again, I want to compare it to Zora Neale Hurston in her book, Mules and Men. There's also like at the end of the book, some like voodoo medicine. And it mixes those things where like the same type of way where it's like, oh, do you have rheumatism? Is your heart broken? Did somebody put something akin to like the evil eye on you, and how to like stop it, how to get like violent lovers to leave you alone, things like that, where it's like kind of this mix of different type of things. So super, super fascinating, but mixed kind of like on that same vein of how medical maladies can also have like mystical causes or mythological creatures involvement and whatnot. Now it's time to get to the story portion of like what our podcast normally is. Imagine that. We're going to tell some stories. So since we've been enjoying talking about the evil eye and people having the evil eye so much, I thought I would read a story in here called The Fairy Dance. And Speranza Wilde notes that this is an Irish tale that was told to her by a native of one of the Western Isles, where, quote, the primitive superstitions have still all the freshness of young life. Again, using that word like primitive, where it's like, oh, because anthropology, they believed that like, oh, all humans are on this like trajectory away from like, you've got like barbarism, like primitive, and then you're like working up your way up towards, being a real civilized people. And that's not how they view it anymore. So anyway, one evening late in November, which you guys might not know is a month where spirits are the most powerful over all things in Ireland, especially, which you should know because we've talked about like after like October 31st. That's kind of like the dark half of the year where like evil spirits are out, witches have power, the devils have power, stuff like that. So that very much is alive and well in here. So one evening late in November, as the prettiest girl in all the island was going to a well to get some water, her foot slipped and she fell, which is an unlucky omen. It didn't kill her or anything like that, but she just like slipped.
I consider it an unlucky omen when I have slipped and fallen too.
Yeah, but usually the unlucky thing that happens to me when I start slipping is that like I'm going all the way down, maybe.
Yeah, I guess that is it. It's not an omen. It's just an unfortunate thing that happened.
Yeah. So she slipped and fell a little bit, which was an unlucky omen. And then when she got up and she looked around, everything suddenly looked strange to her. Strange and like out of place.
Mm-hmm.
Almost as if things had been enchanted.
Ah.
So it was like in some way she like slipped into
like an alternate dimension.
Yeah.
This is like one of those what's it called?
Glitches in the Matrix.
Well, yeah, and there's like isn't there like magic realism? Isn't that like it's like a literary genre?
Yes.
Where it's basically like you walk up one staircase and you walk down the other, and it's like you've entered into a new world that looks exactly like the world that you left, but all the light switches turn the lights off when you switch them down and on, or wait, I mean on when you switch them down and off when you switch them up. It's like, but that's the only thing that's different, and it's like magic that did that.
Yeah, it's exactly like that.
One of those type situations.
And so she was like looking around herself and she saw that there was this like big crowd that had gathered around a blazing fire that, you know, she hadn't seen off in the distance before that little slip by the well.
Uh-huh.
And she found herself being like drawn towards them until she was standing in the middle of all of these people, but they had kept completely silent looking at her, which I'm like, sounds like a horrifying like dream where it's suddenly all this like big group of people around a bonfire being like completely silent, like, ooh, spooky. So everybody was quiet, but then they all slowly turned and were like looking at her. And she was like afraid. She was like terrified because that is like a really freaky thing that they've just described.
Mm-hmm.
And so she turned to run so that she could get away, but she couldn't. And then out of this crowd came this like beautiful young prince. And he had like a red sash across him and it says golden band on his long yellow hair. So like, yeah, he's got this like golden crown on his head and he's got this like long flowing yellow hair, which I do want to say that J.R.R. Tolkien based his elves off of the Tuatha De Danann, the elven folk of like Celtic mythology.
Interesting.
So yeah, I'm like, picture Legolas.
Tolkien.
No.
Orlando Bloom.
Yes. With his blonde wig. No. And so he walked up to her and asked her to dance. And then she replied to him, well, it's a foolish thing of you, sir, to ask me to dance when there is no music. And then he lifted up his hand and, you know, made some kind of signal to the people. And instantly the sweetest music sounded near her and around her. And the young man took her hand and they danced and danced till the moon and the stars went down. But she seemed like one floating on the air and she forgot everything in the world except the dancing, which it was like very much believed that the music of the fairy folk can like basically like hypnotize you and like trap you in that like realm forever. So it's like very dangerous for her that she was kind of like,
she was grooving to
crazy
it.
For you to ask me to dance when there is no music. It's like, girl, don't ask for music. Don't ask for music. So yeah, everything in her mind just like, you know, flew out of her mind, left her except for dancing, the sweet music, and this beautiful elven man in front of her. So then eventually the dancing ceased and this like prince thanked her for the dance, and he invited her to go and eat supper with the company. Danger, never eat the food. So she saw in like the ground, because they had been again dancing like out in the open, like in the fields around this like blazing fire.
Mhm.
But then in the ground, there like opened this like hole in the earth, and she like walked down into the ground, down this like flight of steps, like with them. So like her and the prince basically walked down first, and then all of that group that had been up there like followed behind them, because he clearly was like the prince, king, leader, somebody important.
Yeah.
So when they got down the staircase, they came to this large hall, and it was brightly lit, and there was gold and silver, and the table was just covered with like all kinds of delicacies and treats, and wine was being poured into golden cups so that everybody could have, you know, some wine to drink. And she sat down, and everybody kind of like, you know, sat down at the table, crowded in around her. And it says that she was weary after the dancing, and she took the golden cup that the prince handed her, and she started to raise it to her lips to drink. And just as she was raising it to her lips to take a drink, this man passed closely behind her, and he whispered, "Eat no food and drink no wine, or you will never reach your home again." And so she just like set down the cup and didn't drink anything. And people started to notice that she wasn't drinking anything, and they started to get like really mad. And this one man was like, "Whoever comes to us must drink with us." And he like grabbed her by the arm and like held the wine to her lips to kind of like
Yikes.
force it down her throat. But in that moment, the man who had like come and walked behind her, he kind of gets in front of her, and she can see that he's this red-haired man in front of her. And he took her by the hand, and he led her back out of like the hallway. And he said to her, "You're safe for this time. Quick, take this herb and hold it in your hand till you reach home, and no one can harm you." And he handed her this plant, and it was a piece of ground ivy, which I always think that the plant stuff is really interesting, because it's like fairies are around hawthorn trees, so you never cut down a hawthorn tree.
Mhm.
But the ground ivy, not ground up ivy, but like the ivy that like creeps on like the ground, is like a talisman. So she like took this plant from this red-haired man and fled out of like the hall, like up the footsteps. And for a while she could hear like footsteps behind her of like people like chasing behind her. But she just like, you know, went up the staircase, out through the ground. She was out in this field. She ran past the well back to her house, all the while like holding this like ground ivy in her hand.
Mhm.
And when she reached her house, she went inside and she barred the door, and then she laid down to go to bed. And she could hear this like big like clamber, loud noises outside, and voices that were like screaming out, "The power we have over you is gone through the magic of the herb. But wait, when you dance again to the music on the hill, you will stay with us forevermore, and none shall hinder." But she just kept holding on to the magic plant that this red-haired man had given her. And after like the night had like passed away, the fairies didn't trouble her anymore. It said, "But it was long and long before the sound of the fairy music left her ears, which she had danced to that November night on the hillside with her fairy lover."
Mm.
So it's super interesting about the red-haired man is that he pops up in several different tales inside of the fairy realm and saves human beings. And it almost seems like who is this guy? What is his deal here, being like a red-haired man? And like in line with like the evil eye, one thing that kind of goes along with that, like that makes it more likely that a person might have the evil eye, is if they have red hair.
Of course.
Which is so funny because we think of red hair as this like very Irish thing
Mhm.
now in like our like modern context. But like Irish people, when you're like reading through like about like the culture and like people, they did not like people with red hair. There was something that they felt was like innately wrong with them.
Mhm.
And part of that goes back to this like belief that Judas Iscariot was a redhead.
I just recently heard something like about this about red hair, and that was the first time that I had heard
Oh, that
thing about like the
Judas Iscariot.
Iscariot had red hair. I was like, supposedly. It's like, what? Okay.
Yeah, I'm like every time that I like re-find that out, I'm always like, oh my gosh, that's right. That's right that it's
a
this,
thing that
like,
is said.
That is said, yeah, not a thing that is like historically true, because wild if true. It'd be weird. Like that would be very noticeable from that area if he was like a redheaded man.
Mhm.
But it kind of like had this idea of like, oh, he was like a redhead, and so like there's a thing with like redheaded people are somehow possibly like in league with the devil, or a little too intimately involved with him, or too easily influenced like by demonic forces. And so it says in here, red hair is supposed to have a most malignant influence. And it is even passed into a proverb, quote, let not the eye of a red-haired woman rest on you.
Yikes.
I'm like, wow. That's why I stopped dyeing my hair red, because I killed that man with putting an evil eye on him. True story. No, just kidding. He didn't die. He's alive.
Yeah,
I didn't
and that's
kill-
how we know
I-
you didn't
Jeff-
put the evil eye in him, because if you had, he'd be
He'd be
dead.
Dead. And so this idea of like red hair being a little bit associated with the devil, being associated with like badness,
Mhm.
that was like kind of what was in like the cultural mind at the time about like red-haired people. And so for there to be this like mysterious red-haired guy that pops up in the fairy realm, so he's clearly with the fairies,
Right.
but he's not on their side, or he seems to like be working against the interest of like the king, because obviously the king wanted this, like the story starts off prettiest girl. He wanted this like prettiest girl.
Mhm.
And this guy's working against what the fairy king wants, and is like, oh, I'm gonna stop this girl before she like gets stuck here as well. And so there's kind of this like question of like, who is this guy? And is this guy Judas? Like, is this guy somehow related to Judas, in that when like the Christian element started mixing with like the Celtic mythology and how they viewed the Tuatha De Danann, the like fairy people, it's very slippery between fairies and what's purgatory, what is hell, like where is hell theologically in connection with like the fairy realm. And so it kind of makes sense that there is possibly this person who is human that is living with the elves, that for one reason or another is trapped there himself, isn't entirely on their side. So he's kind of in this like middle ground. And so it's like, it's not Judas, but could possibly, yeah, like the reason why he's in the story could be because of something like that. But now we're going to talk about something that actually does not get mentioned a whole lot in this book. So, Jeff, when you think of stereotypical, like Irish, oh, it's going to be St. Patrick's Day, I'm going to get some like
shamrocks, corned beef and cabbage, green stuff, gonna find a leprechaun and steal his gold.
Yeah. Hope a banshee doesn't come out and start like screaming and wailing. Like, as Americans, when we think of things that are like Irish mythology, one of the biggest things that we think of are leprechauns. It is like just this huge thing. And so you would think that this book, that is this woman trying to like capture the superstitions, the folklore of Ireland, You would think that, leprechauns would make kind of a bigger impression.
But I'm taking it that they do not.
They do not. I did a search through the document to see where I could find references to leprechauns so that I could, kind of get the stories that include leprechauns that she has, and then any of the superstition stuff that went with it.
Mhm.
But no, there were like 2 stories that were connected to each other about leprechauns. And then the word pops up in one quote later in the book. And then that's it. Because leprechauns, as it would turn out, they do have ancient roots in Irish mythology and stories, but they were not that big of a deal. They weren't that big of a character, and definitely not the way that we kind of like typically imagine them, of wearing kind of like, I would describe it as like pilgrimy type looking clothes and red beards and wearing green. That depiction of them is very much based on racist stereotypes about Irish people at the time, because the clothes that they have them wearing were seen as these kind of like outdated clothes, where it was like, oh,
Right.
England had moved on from these clothes, but not the Irish, because they're a backward people, which is like, that's horrible. The green is very much a like, oh, Ireland, shamrocks are green. Irish people, they are big into green. We're going to put them in green clothes. And then like redheaded, because the Irish people, they got like red hair, and red beards. And so like, of course, that's what like a leprechaun is going to look like. But no, what they more historically had been described as is like, yes, small people, typically when they were being described, they were like closer to being 6 inches tall.
Oh, wow.
At the most,
That's
like
interesting.
like a foot tall. And did I say already that they would be wearing red and not green?
Interesting.
And typically their hair and their beard, is like brown.
Right.
Like an adult Irish man, like like the most like kind of common look. But I want to say that one of the earliest textual like mentions of a leprechaun that exists, it is found from an 8th century text. So that's, it's pretty long ago. Mentioned in the middle of this longer saga tale about the King of Ulster. And in the story, there's a point where he falls asleep on a beach and he wakes up and finds himself being dragged down into the sea by 3 leprechaun. I can't even begin to guess how this is supposed to be pronounced, but it's Luchorpain. Leprechaun.
Yeah.
Leprechaun? Something.
No idea.
And so he has to quickly kind of like fight off these like 3 leprechauns that are like dragging him down like into the sea. And after he fights them off, and he kind of like gains the upper hand and captures them, and then they have to grant him 3 wishes in exchange, like 1 wish apiece for him to like release them. And that's like the most information that we get about these guys from like the 8th century. And so very different from, I think, like how we think about them. But then they would pop up periodically in stories, and it's kind of up for debate about how we can view these creatures, because some people want to classify them as like solitary fairies, or like fairy folk, the fae that might have had some kind of like an evil spirit, or they're like a degenerate form of a fairy, like all these kind of like different descriptions. And this is controversial, In the rest of Europe, there are a lot of household helper fairy folk creature type dealios. I'm talking gnomes, tomta, brownies, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That leprechauns are more like them, where they were seen as constantly helping shoemakers, and that like they would be found sitting somewhere with like shoemaker tools in hand, working on fixing shoes. And then slowly it morphed to like they're fixing their own shoes because they're constantly running around like all over the place. But back when they were thought to be these like supernatural like creatures that were helping like shoemakers and tradespeople, and so you could find them, you know, kind of like out in the fields working on like different fixer-upper helper tasks. They also were apparently bearing witness to where stashes of treasure were being hidden, because they would just, you know, be hiding in a bush on the side of a road, surreptitiously like watching people as they were hiding, like burying their like gold and stuff before going into like a battle or a war or whatever, so that even if like their armies were defeated, they would have like stashes of like gold somewhere. And the leprechauns were keeping track of where all of this was being hidden. And because with their kind of like magic powers, they were able to move some of this treasure. Sometimes people would go back to where they thought they had left their treasure and it would be gone. And it's because Leprechaun had added it to his own little stash of treasure. And so he, like, leprechauns got this like relationship with the fairy mounds, but also like hiding treasure in these mounds or finding other secret places to like hide these things. And then you have, you know, the stories where if you grab them, they grant you a wish. Maybe one of your wishes could be that they tell you where their treasure is hidden. So you have these like old stories, but again, they're not huge characters that like have these big arcs the way that a lot of these different elven kings kind of end up with their own from mythology. These like fairy kings end up with these like different story cycles, and so fairies are a much bigger chunk of information available when you're looking at Irish folklore and fairy tales. And leprechauns are not. But because leprechauns kind of became the mascot in the United States for Irish people, Ireland was able to kind of like take that and run with it and use it for their travel tourism boards.
Right.
And so they would like lean into it really hard for the sake of other people, because they're like, oh, the one thing that they know and like about us are like apparently leprechauns. So like,
Well,
let's just keep hamming it up for them. Yeah. And so in the United States, we think that leprechauns are going to be this really, really like big, huge thing in Irish folktale and fairy tales. And they're really not. Like historically, yes, they did exist like in the stories, but they exist almost as much as this other type of creature that I wanted to tell you about, that is, instead of like a leprechaun, they're the clurachaun.
I'm pretty sure those are the ones that fought the Transformers.
The clurachaun. But what people have like argued is that this other little like mythological creature, that it's not different from a leprechaun, it's just a drunk leprechaun. They're like, it's just an alcoholic leprechaun.
I love that.
Because instead of it being like a leprechaun who is like helping shoemakers and is like this industrious, like hardworking, trickstery type of like character that like doesn't want you to grab it and demand wishes from it, and so it'll do whatever it can to like trick you out of it. Clurachaun were found usually inside, in the stories, they were usually found in breweries, pubs, and locking themselves into wine cellars.
Okay.
Basically, it's like, so I'm like, go with me on this. If we think of leprechaun as kind of like tomta, brownies, gnomes, like these kind of like homestead helpers, but then you have a homestead helper who like accidentally helped himself to a little much wine in your wine cellar. And so like now he's kind of like drunk and angry in your wine cellar. And then the problems that they were known to cause were like they would accidentally leave the tap on so that your alcohol would like spill out, or they'd be like knocking around down there drunk, making like a mess, like ripping like the whole thing apart, and like just being like drunk menaces. And so I want to say it was like William Yates who was saying that like all they are is leprechauns on a drinking spree. And I'm
That's
like,
amazing.
that is like so super funny. But also, again, like there are a bunch of tales that involve these little guys the same way that, you know, there's like tales that involve leprechauns. But because we kind of like, because the outside world latched onto leprechauns so hard, like it became like more of a thing than it historically had been like among the folk. And so in that vein, we're going to have Geoff tell a story that in this book, it's just called The Leprechaun, because that was the most distinguishing feature about this story that was different from the other ones, is that like this one has a leprechaun.
So the first thing I thought was really interesting that I had never seen before, where it explains, it says leprechaun, or Leith space Brogan, which I don't know. It looks like it would be Leith Brogan or something, but I'm pretty sure that that's one of those things with like Irish, like the EI, like the TH doesn't make a th sound there, but I don't know what it does because I do not speak Irish. But anyway, it means artisan of the brogue, which is kind of funny.
Well, yeah, I'm like, brogues are shoes, in case people wanted to know. They're a style of shoe.
This story starts off with a brief summary definition of what a leprechaun is. The leprechauns are merry, industrious, tricksy little sprites who do all the shoemaker's work and the tailors and the cobblers for the fairy gentry, and are often seen at sunset under the hedge singing and stitching. And they also know the secrets of hidden treasure, and if they like somebody, they'll be happy to guide them to the spot where a pot of gold hides buried. It is believed that there is a family that now lives near Castleria, came to their riches in a strange way. And that strange way was through the good generosity of a leprechaun. And that wealth has been handed down through generations since then. But it starts off not with a wealthy individual or a wealthy family, but with a poor boy who was one of their forefathers, who used to drive his cart back and forth, trying to make what money he could through sale. But he was, according to some, a strange boy. He was silent and moody, and so much so that people thought that he might have been a fairy changeling himself. But he never liked to play. He never really spoke to anybody. He just spent all his time reading old books, and that's about it. But the one thing that he longed for above all else was to get rich, which that was probably the most normal thing about this young man.
You're like, relatable.
So he wanted to get rich, and mostly he wanted, I mean, this is super relatable too. He wanted to be able to like give up this job, hauling this cart around selling turf, and be able to live in peace and quietness alone, with nothing but his books around him, a beautiful garden, and a beautiful house.
Oh man.
All to himself, all by himself.
That's the dream.
So because he had read in these old books, he'd read about leprechauns, and he knew that leprechauns knew where gold lay hidden. And so he, day by day, watched and kept his little peepers out for the sight of one of these little cobblers. And he kept his ears open for the click, click, click of the hammer as he sat under the hedge mending shoes. And one evening, he saw just that. A little fellow under a dock leaf working away, dressed all in green, with a cocked hat on his head, working on some shoes. And so the boy jumped down from his cart and grabbed this little leprechaun by the neck and basically threatened him. He's like, "You're going to tell me where the gold is." And the leprechaun's like, wait, hold up. Don't hurt me. If you don't hurt me, I'll tell you. And just so you know, like, I could hurt you if I wanted to, I don't want to, because we are cousins once removed, the leprechaun said. And because we're near relations, which is like, oh, because they thought that he was a fairy changeling.
Yeah. And so it's like, maybe he was. I love the idea of like somebody who doesn't want to go out and play sports, but they just want to sit in their house and like read books. They're like, you might
Something's wrong with
be,
that kid.
might be a changeling. I'm like, it's everybody in my house.
You might be able to find leprechauns, and they'll be more lenient on you because y'all might be related.
Oh my gosh, that's how I keep putting the evil eye on people.
And so because of that near relationship that they had, the leprechaun was like, you know what? I'll show you where this secret gold is. Because, again, we're related. No one's allowed to have the secret gold, but those who are of, quote, fairy blood and race. So he's like, come on, let's go. And they went really fast until the last glow of the sun had vanished. No, they didn't do that. They did rush, but because as soon as the sun had set and the last glow of the red sun had vanished, so would the gold, and they'd never see it again. Which was interesting because there's no mention of a rainbow, but it does have to do with the light of the sun refracting through the atmosphere.
No.
And so the boy's like, all right, let's go. So he carried the leprechaun in the turf cart and they drove off. And they went to this old fort, went through a door of stone in the wall. And the leprechaun was like, hey, look around, look at all this stuff. And the boy looked around and he saw that the entire ground was covered in gold and that there was vessels of silver and pretty much like all the riches imaginable in the world were just scattered around on the floor. And so the leprechaun's like, all right, take whatever you want, but you got to go quickly because if this door shuts, because once this door shuts, you're never going in or out of this place ever again. So the boy gathered up as much as he could, full of his arms of silver and gold, and flung them into the cart, and he was out of there before the door shut like a clap of thunder, and the place became dark as night. And he never saw the leprechaun again, and didn't even have time to thank him. But he thought it was best to get on with his treasure and go home. And when he found himself alone, all by himself, he counted all of his money, sorting all the gold pieces from the silver pieces, realizing it was, quote, enough for a king's ransom, which means he was crazy rich.
Yeah.
And just like any of you, if you win the lottery, this young man was wise and told no one, but went off the next day to Dublin and put all his treasures into the bank and found out that he was as rich as a lord. So this is when he ordered a big fine house to be built and spacious gardens, and he hired servants and carriages and books to his heart's content. And he says he gathered wise men around him, and he became one of the great and powerful men of the country, where even still to this day his memory is held in high honor, and his descendants are living rich and prosperous because their wealth has never decreased, even though they have given a lot to the poor, and they're noted for being very friendly of heart and liberal of hand. The end. Which I love that little ending too, where it's like he got rich, but then he wasn't like, him and his family didn't just like hoard it all themselves. He did all this great stuff like for himself, built this big house, fancy gardens, bought all the books that he wanted. But it was like they never ran out of money, even though they were giving liberally to the poor. It's like, that was super nice. Way to give back.
I also really like the idea of like Speranza Wilde writing that as like the happily ever after for this family, is that they get to sit and be highly educated and just be able to like relax in the joy of like learning. Like they don't have to worry about how are we going to like make money from day to day. That is all set up. We're good. Now we can just focus on like learning and reading. And
I mean, that is the dream, man. I'll tell you what.
That is the dream. So I hope that we've been able to give a little taste of this book by Speranza Wilde. And again, the title of that book is Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland by Lady Jane Francesca Wilde, also known as Speranza. And please, 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 I highly recommend looking it up and like reading the stories. It is a lot of good fun, a lot of interesting stuff. Even if you just like skip around to just the stories that it contains, and if you're not interested in, like how to cure warts, it's okay. That's totally fine. But I want to leave with this quote by Speranza Wilde because I think it's super interesting listening to her describing the Irish people because she's an insider in that culture. Like, she is an Irish woman.
Mhm.
And where if I was like making these statements, I don't know, you might be taking them like a different way or whatever, because I'm an outsider from like that culture. And so I think that this quote in the book is really interesting. She says, "The very tendency to superstition so marked in Irish nature arises from an instinctive dislike to the narrow limitations of common sense. It is characterized by a passionate yearning toward the vague, the mystic, the invisible, and the boundless infinite of the realms of imagination. Therefore, the people of the fairy mansions, have an irresistible attraction for the Irish heart. Like them, the Irish love youth, beauty, splendor, lavish generosity, music and song, the feast and the dance. The mirth and the reckless gaiety of the national temperament finds its true exponent in the mad pranks of the puka and the leprechaun, the merry spirits that haunt the dells and glens and look out at the wayfarer from under the dock leaf with their glittering eyes. The inspiration that rises to poetry under the influence of excitement is expressed by the belief in the she who gives power to song, while the deep pathos of Irish nature finds its fullest representation in the tender, plaintive spiritual music of the wail and lamentation of the banshee." I just really like that idea of the Irish people creating their legends around themselves. Because it kind of is like, it makes me think about like other cultures where I'm like, don't we all do that? Don't we all like create our mythologies and our stories around what we think the world should be like, or even what we think we are like in the best versions of ourselves and in the worst versions of ourselves, like in our expressions of like joy and celebration, and then also in our expressions of grief. And so I just think it's beautifully insightful, and I just want to encourage everybody to go out there and dive into some of the amazing work of Speranza Wilde.
Thank you for listening to The Fairy Tellers. If you enjoy what we're doing, please leave us a review or share us with your friends. For access to exclusive bonus content, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thefairytellers. Special thanks to Andy Forey for our music and to Clarice Inch for our artwork. And of course, a big thank you to all our patrons. Without all of you, this show wouldn't be possible.
Good stories pay little attention to cultural or linguistic frontiers. The student of story collections find themselves adrift on an ocean of stories, an ocean which is boundless, deep, and ceaseless in motion. Robert Irwin.
He's like, "Why?" And I'm like, oh, I saw my children.
Oh, I thought you were acting right now, like joking.
No, I out of the corner of my eye saw movement, and then there was like a thing, and it was just my children.